One little piece of political swag that I did bring back from the convention was the Doug signs, for Doug Emhoff.
Oh, yeah.
My neighbor, who's also named Doug, was like, I like some of those. And I was like, okay. So I ran in on that night of the convention and just grabbed a bunch of them. And so I think he's going to frame it.
Amazing.
Did you guys have any other recent political swag from these past few months from the conventions or otherwise that you're now rocking in your personal life?
I still have this one shirt that I'll wear every once in a while, and I'm like, such a relic. It has every single Democrat who ran, and there's so many. I always forget how many Democrats ran in 2020, and they're crossed out, and it's oh no, this person jumped back in. Okay, top 5. Oh no, let's add this person last minute. It's just the most chaotic shirt, and I'm like, that was the energy of 2020.
Welcome to the Campaign Moment on this Friday, October 11th. I'm Martine Powers, co-host of Post Reports.
And I'm Aaron Blake, senior politics reporter and author of the Campaign Moment newsletter. We're also joined this week by Mariana Sotomayor, a congressional reporter for The Post who covers the House of Representatives. Hey, Mariana.
Hey, how are you guys?
Good. Thank you for being here.
Of course.
So this week, we're going to talk about control of Congress and specifically whether Democrats can flip the House of Representatives. Republicans have an incredibly slim majority, and they're defending a lot of seats in districts that President Biden won 4 years ago.
Yeah, and we're also going to be talking about a couple other issues, including the politics of hurricane response and the interviews that Vice President Kamala Harris has done this week across many platforms. We'll talk about how she performed, what kind of impact these interviews could have on the race, and where we stand in that process.
Yeah, I'm very excited to dig into that. But let's start with the House. Mariana, all the things about the House of Representatives. This is your bread and butter. And as we said, Democrats are trying to flip the House. And you were recently actually on the West Coast covering some of the races that could help Democrats do that. So tell me a little bit about this trip that you went on and some of your reporting.
Yeah, so we're down to the final weeks. And here's the thing. Democrats only have to flip 4 seats that Republicans currently hold. And that is not much at all. Democrats have a ton of districts across the country where it's possible that they could oust a number of Republicans. So it's not only possible that they get the majority, it's possible that they could have an even larger majority than Republicans did, which was just a majority of 5. We know a lot of the struggles and problems that such a slim majority can bring, testing any kind of conference and, of course, leadership. So Democrats, they don't just want the majority. They want it to be significantly bigger so they can overcome any legislative hurdles in the future. But, of course, right now, a lot of these districts, interestingly enough, are in very liberal states. So I went out to California. Obviously, Vice President Kamala Harris is going to win there. Obviously, Adam Schiff, who's running for Senate as a Democrat, is going to win there. It's just the history of the state.
Yeah.
But there are 5 very swingy districts right now represented by Republicans that are literally within the margin of error of any kind of polling. And it's fascinating to go to these places because a lot of these districts that I went to, they're very different. One of them is represented by Congressman David Valadao. He represents the Central Valley, a much more rural agricultural district. There are so many Trump, Vance, massive signs lining a number of farms as you drive around his district. And he's one who has shied away completely of saying who he's even going to vote for in the presidential election because there are still a number of conservative voters who are mad at him and are going to be holding their nose, voting for him because they still remember that he voted to impeach Trump after the January 6th, 2021 insurrection. But, once you're in these districts, you kind of have to look at the different dynamics at play. So many Democratic registered voters in this very big district that Valadao represents, but the turnout level is so low. And that is what helps fuel Valadao in these elections. So you have a Democratic challenger and Rudy Salas, the second time they're facing off with each other. Some of the questions post-election, depending on the outcome, is going to be, did he have enough name ID? Are more Democrats going to turn out to flip these districts? And that is, I know, something that Democrats are working aggressively, and including in another district that I was in, just right outside of the LA suburbs, and totally different kind of landscape, where, again, you have voters who are thinking a little bit more conservatively. They are voters who miss the economy under Trump. That is something that I've heard across the board is affordability in many different ways, whether it's from the grocery store to potentially buying a home. That is front of mind for voters. And the interesting dynamic about living under a liberal state for many of these voters is though they care about abortion access, they know they will always have it. Because, the state legislature has either passed legislation to protect those rights or voters themselves. In the last election, California codified access to abortion, IVF, all these issues that in more battleground swingy states are under threat. That is more front of mind for, let's say voters in Arizona who have to vote on a measure. In California, they can talk about the economy, crime, issues that Republicans are actually succeeding in polling among voters.
Wait, so beyond California, and I know there's, as you said, some very competitive House seats there, like what is the rest of the map? Like where are the other places where we're seeing House seats that could potentially dictate control of the House? And Aaron, I know that you have been looking at this recently too, like trying to get a lay of the land here.
Yeah, the House map is diverse, but I would say that, it's actually kind of a smaller battlefield than we're accustomed to. Maybe, I don't know if Mariana agrees with that, but that's at least my perception. It's not just California, it's also New York. New York has a lot of districts that voted for a Republican in 2022, but had voted for Biden 2 years prior. So that's going to be a real central battleground in the race for control of the House. We also do see some, swingy districts sprinkled in the battleground states in the presidential race, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Wisconsin, and Michigan especially. And then there's some districts that we know are going to flip because there were redistrictings done since the last election. So Republicans are set to gain a bunch of seats in North Carolina, and Democrats are probably going to gain some seats in Louisiana and Alabama, I believe.
I agree with you, Aaron. If you're looking at swing districts that existed over the past 10 years or 20 years, there were so many more options. There were so many more competitive districts. And because redistricting has become so polarized and parties just want to draw as many districts that they could reliably win, it is a historically low number. I think it's only like 30 to 35 districts that are in play. And that makes it harder to have these larger majorities or try and find more consensus or elect lawmakers who are willing to cross the aisle. And in the last couple of weeks, we're seeing Democrats starting to have more momentum in the middle of the country.
Wait, why is that?
So Democrats and Republicans are pointing to two different factors here. One is Vice President Kamala Harris entering the race and completely boosting the Democratic Party, Democratic voters who, interestingly enough, when it was Biden atop of the ticket, they weren't really excited for him. So we have seen Democratic campaigns, including at the House level, just being able to recruit volunteers, bring in historic number of fundraising. The amount of money that Democrats have in comparison to Republicans is insane. Like you just see Democratic ads way more on the airwaves. You just see Democrats more present, and Republicans are really concerned that their candidates don't have enough money to tell their stories, don't have enough money to compete on the airwaves. So in these critical final weeks where people are starting to kind of finally tune in and really think about like, who's even running for Congress? Republicans are starting to fret a little bit more that they're just not as competitive in these last final weeks. It's why you're seeing a lot of races in Iowa start to pop up, Nebraska. These reliably, though kind of ish, maybe lean Republican districts are now starting to move more into toss-up territory.
So at this point for both of you, like, what do you think the odds are that Democrats are actually going to be successful in flipping the House?
Well, it's kind of a cop-out to say it's 50-50, but it is very close. I mean, there's so few battlegrounds and the majority is so tight right now. We're all asking ourselves where, how are the polls off in one direction or the other right now? I think it's worth noting that Democrats ever since Kamala Harris got into this race have gained a slight advantage on something we've talked about on the show before, which is a generic ballot. Basically, it asks people, if there was an unnamed Democrat and an unnamed Republican running for Congress, which one would you prefer? Democrats have led on that measure by about 2 points recently. And then the other thing that I think is worth noting here is I mentioned the generic ballot, and that's because we don't have a lot of polling in these specific House races. There's a real dearth of specific data in these key races, and that leads to some uncertainty. But what I will say is what we've seen in these Senate races is that Democrats are very often running ahead of the top of the ballot. That's been the case for months where, dating back to Joe Biden and even with Kamala Harris now, in these battleground states, the Democrat is usually running better. I don't know that we know if that's going to be the case in the House races, but we have seen some encouraging polls in recent days. I'm thinking of Scott Perry's district in Pennsylvania, which is a big one. Mariana mentioned Iowa. So there are some things for Democrats to grab hold of and have some optimism here, but it's just going to be very close.
Well, it's also just such an interesting moment because, we've talked on the show in recent episodes about what's going on with the Senate at the same time, right? That Democrats are holding on to this extremely narrow majority, and it doesn't look great for them that they'll be able to hold on to the majority after the election. You have John Tester in Montana, Sherrod Brown in Ohio, two Democrats that are trying to keep their seats in states where Republicans tend to do very well. And so you're facing this possibility that, both parts of Congress might flip to the other side in a way that, have we ever seen that before?
Shockingly, no. At least in this double flip scenario. We have lived under divided government many, many, many a time.
Because it's usually a wave, right? That it's there's a wave of Democrats or a wave of Republicans who do well. And so we'll get one or both chambers of the House over to the other side. But in this scenario, if it does turn out that they both flip, it's not really a wave. It's just chaos.
Yes. It's a lot of expecting, again, divided government. This past year, so this congressional term, the 118th Congress, is set to be the most historically unproductive Congress ever.
Oh, gosh.
I think last year alone, they passed 27 bills, but most of them were just renaming a post office or reauthorizing a random thing. Obviously, Congress was able to fund the government and send money to allies abroad. Those were big deal issues. But regardless of who is president, we're going to likely be dealing with possibly a Democratic House, possibly a Republican Senate. And we all know how that's worked out in the past. It's hard to find consensus nowadays in divided government.
But what do you think that signifies? If it does turn out that the House flips to Democrats, that the Senate flips to Republicans, what does that say about where voters' heads are at and where the country is at right now?
Well, when it comes to the Senate races, at least, I think Democrats have known that they just had a really terrible map to defend a number of Democrats and Republican seats. But when it comes to the House, I genuinely have found myself wondering, are we living in a House where, the Democrats hold the majority for 2 years, then it flips to Republicans for 2 years, and then it flips to Democrats for 2 years? That's not ideal in terms of if you get things done, that those legislative successes, whichever party you're from, actually stays, because usually when the parties flip, they're let's undo whatever the Democrats did. Let's undo whatever the Republicans did. So that's just not good for lasting, overarching change, regardless of how you define change based on the party that you're in.
Interesting. So let's move on from this forecast for the House and talk briefly about what's been going on with Hurricane Milton. And from a political angle, obviously, hurricanes are the kind of external factor that are out of both parties' control but have a huge impact on the race. Aaron, you had a conversation with our colleague Dan Balls on Hurricane Helene last week and how that might play out, especially in North Carolina, where the cleanup is continuing. And of course, now we have Hurricane Milton that struck Florida this week. At this point, the death count there is at least 15 people. More than 2 million people are still without power there, and rescue operations are continuing. So I'm curious what your sense is of how the recovery efforts in Florida and North Carolina are going to impact the election.
Yeah, I think there is no question that a large-scale disaster like this can have a significant impact. And these ones happen to be hitting states that are very important to the race for the presidency. It kind of seems crass to talk about politics when people are recovering, but these are very real issues that officials and the campaigns are confronting right now. This week I looked back at history and I wanted to see, if we had examples of major disasters like these and how they impacted the politics, the voting in the following election. One is Hurricane Katrina. Obviously, that's the big storm that comes to mind when people are thinking about these things.
Of course.
Happened in August of 2005. New Orleans had a mayoral election 8 months later, and turnout dropped by more than 10 points. We saw much more of a drop among Black voters in particular because those neighborhoods were more likely to be displaced. 8 months later, half the city was still displaced. So it had a significant impact on that city's politics and that city's election.
And that was a hurricane that happened in August, right?
Yeah, so they had 8 months to deal with this, and they sent absentee ballots out to Houston and all over the country for people who were displaced, and they still had a very significant drop in turnout.
Marianne, I'm curious, since you have been out in the world traveling to some of these swing districts, have you heard people talking about what's been going on with the hurricanes, or what is your sense of how hurricane recovery is playing out in people's minds?
Yeah, it actually came up way more than I even thought it would. I mean, I was out west. Our colleague Leanne Caldwell was also in Nevada. She heard from so many Nevadans about how, Biden's only sending recovery money to Democratic parts of a state or Democratic-leaning states or to states that Democrats need to win in the presidential election.
But which, to be clear, isn't true.
Right, exactly. So there was a lot of these conspiracy theories, and I actually heard it from a voter as well who pointed out that fact. Oh, did you hear that Biden, he's only helping the Democrats, not helping Republicans like us. So, we were out west.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see. I am also Martina Floridian. I'm from Tampa. So this past storm was really scary for
I can imagine.
Many family and friends.
Yeah, hopefully they're all okay.
Yes, thankfully everyone's good. On the congressional level, Florida has now become a little bit more reliably Republican on many fronts. It's going to be incredibly interesting, I think, to me. Just right next to Tampa is the St. Petersburg area. And obviously, Hurricane Helene really did damage in the last couple of weeks in that part of Tampa. And it is maybe the only swingy-ish, still lean Republican district on the House side. It's currently represented by Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna. And she is someone who, she spoke to President Biden, but has also been kind of misconstruing how that conversation went. The White House had to respond to say, no, Biden is actually trying to, send as much money as possible. But I also have to wonder, how much are locals paying attention to that? Really, when you're in those situations, you're wondering, when is the government going to help me recover? How is it going to help me recover? And that is actually a big point of debate right now. Congress is obviously out until literally 1 month from today, November 11th. They come back. And I've talked to a couple of Republican leadership members and aides who privately are saying, we don't know the cost of these hurricanes. We just don't know the toll here. Even at this moment, we may not know a month from now. And that in and of itself is going to delay Congress passing disaster relief. I'm sure they're going to do it. There's just so much bipartisan will to be able to do that. But then you also have Republicans talking about offsetting costs, and that could add a whole other element to the debate and potential delay in sending money to areas that really need it.
Well, we'll see how that plays out. We're going to take a break here. When we come back, we'll talk more about the top of the Democratic ticket and about the many interviews that Vice President Kamala Harris has done this week and what those efforts could mean for the race. We'll be right back. So, Aaron, we've seen a lot of Vice President Kamala Harris from this past week on all kinds of platforms, on TV, in podcasts. Of course, this comes after a lot of criticism that she hasn't been giving interviews, that she hasn't been appearing in less scripted or less controlled situations. And so it seems like this is her campaign's response to that. This is the moment where she's ramping this up. You've been writing about how your impressions of this kind of mini media blitz. What do you think?
Yeah, Harris has done a lot of interviews this week. She went on the Call Her Daddy podcast.
I was the first vice president or president to ever in office go to a reproductive health care clinic, ever.
Really?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
I didn't know that, but I guess that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
She was on Stephen Colbert's late night show.
Now we asked ahead of time because I can't just be giving a drink to the Vice President of the United States without asking. You asked for Miller High Life. You asked for Miller High Life.
60 Minutes.
I believe that the American people recognize that the true measure of the strength of a leader is not based on who you beat down, it's based on who you lift up.
She also did a town hall with Univision on Thursday night. Howard Stern's show she was also on. So it's clear that her campaign, I think, decided that they want to put her out there more in unscripted settings, which has been a criticism that has been leveled at her campaign, that they've just not put her out there enough besides at rallies and at debates and things like that. And so she's been out there doing that more. I think there was a significant moment when she was on The View where she was asked what she would have done differently from Biden.
There is not a thing that comes to mind in terms of, and I've been a part of most of the decisions that have had impact.
This is undoubtedly not how the Harris campaign would have drawn up this answer. And
Wait, what do you mean by that? What do you hear in that answer that is falling short, one could argue, and what could she have said differently?
Yeah, I mean, she needs to create some distance from President Joe Biden. That much is clear. Biden is not popular. And at other points in the campaign, they've taken a lot more care to do that. We had the debate last month where she said, I'm not Joe Biden and I'm not Donald Trump. She's talked about a new way forward and used language like that. She kind of wants to be the change candidate. Mm-hmm. And so this was an example of her kind of being asked to highlight something that would have happened differently over the last 3.5 years, and she couldn't really do that. And I think that viewers of campaign ads are going to see this clip plenty. It's already popped up in a House campaign ad or two. So I think that was a really significant moment. Another thing that had really struck me in these interviews is that she's also a lot more comfortable talking about her opponent and her kind of broader vision than talking about policy.
I think one really good example of that was on Thursday night in the Univision town hall that she gave, where she talked about Donald Trump as and his comments about only being a dictator on day one. And she basically said, for people who come from countries where they've seen, what a dictator can do, that basically Latin Americans might know or understand the stakes of this better than anyone.
Donald Trump has said he will be a dictator on day one. Many people come from backgrounds and countries of origin, and we know what that means when you're talking about someone who wants to be president of the United States and wants to be a dictator, and what that means in terms of taking freedoms from their people.
Yeah, this one was really interesting, and I was going to point to it because I think it points to this strategy of reaching out to very specific groups. Obviously, if you go on Univision, you're going to be talking to Latino voters who have trended away from Democrats a little bit in recent years. The View and Call Her Daddy were obviously geared towards women voters, the podcast especially towards younger women voters. I think the Howard Stern show is a show that has lots of probably very casual people who aren't watching the campaign terribly closely. And then all of these formats have large viewerships. I think the Harris campaign made a calculation that they need to take their message to a lot of people all at once and to specific constituencies. And so her comments to Latino voters basically a lot of you understand the dangers of having somebody who wants to be a dictator. This is why I am a better candidate for you on that front. I thought that was a thread that ran through a lot of these interviews.
Yeah, hearing Harris not be able to say, oh, I differentiate from Biden on this front, or think, he should have handled this differently. I would bet all my money that Republicans in the House were like, yes, she said it. She's not able to differentiate herself, because the one complaint I keep hearing privately from House Republicans in their moment of kind of starting to fret that they could lose the House, one of them is a direct criticism of Trump, actually. The fact that he is pretty much unprincipled when he's on the campaign stage. He just goes on riffs. They wish that he, because he has the biggest microphone right now in the country, besides Harris, could just spend every minute of the day saying, this is how Harris is exactly like Biden. Harris is an extension. The Republicans do say it. Trump does say it, but then kind of moves on. Republicans are really wishing that he could do a better job of linking Harris to Biden. And the fact that she was unable to say any differences, and I believe even Biden this week said, oh, we're on the same page. The Democrats are the ones who are the gift that keeps on giving to Republicans in this sense. But I don't think that Republicans are, all of a sudden saying, oh my gosh, we're going to win the election because they're the ones linking each other. Because again, there's only so much that House Republicans can do. Sure, they can put this in an ad. They could be saying it on the campaign trail themselves. But if the top of the ticket isn't doing it to a ton of voters, that's their one worry among Republicans. And I would even say Republicans in the Senate is voters are not disassociating Harris enough away from Biden. Harris doing a good job of kind of centering herself and having a potentially different vision.
Trump has also been doing interviews, but his interviews have been much more geared towards friendly audiences and interviewers and, kind of preaching to the choir. He did go on a podcast this week hosted by Andrew Schultz, which has a little bit of a different viewership. But we haven't seen as much of Trump reaching out to undecided voters as we have seen in Harris in recent days.
Now, I want to come back to something you said before, that in some of these interviews that Harris has done or in the past week, that she has demonstrated more of a comfort talking about kind of her personal life or like personal stuff rather than policy issues. And I thought that was really interesting because I do think, I noticed that too, but I also think that's actually a pretty big shift from how Harris has been able to talk about her personal life in the past, that she, and I think we saw this in 2020, and I think we saw this in the very early stages of Harris coming on as the presidential candidate, a discomfort with knowing how to talk about herself in certain ways, or that when interviewers would kind of offer opportunities for her to speak more personally, that she would struggle with that. And it seems like she has improved on that. I mean, I feel like in the Howard Stern interview, and maybe that just speaks to how good an interviewer Howard Stern is. He got her to gab about all kinds of stuff, of her cereal and her routine and liking Formula One and stuff, where I was oh, I did not know that about Harris.
These guys driving around the cars over and over again in a circle.
It's so good.
You really love that.
We love it. Our whole family does.
It's not a campaign
and
thing.
No, God, no,
wow.
no.
So I thought that was interesting, but also to your point, highlights how the policy stuff is where she's struggling right now in a way that I think is maybe different from how things were before. And in her interview with Bill Whitaker on 60 Minutes, that there were those moments where you could see her not answering questions, him pressing her again and again to get a clear answer, and her continuing to dodge. And I feel like that kind of comes back to this fundamental question of, for the people who aren't sure if they want to vote for Harris or not, do they not want to vote for her because they don't like her policies or don't think that she has clear policies, think that she's a flip-flopper, or are they not voting for her because they say, we haven't gotten a chance to get to know her as a person, or I don't trust her, or I don't know if I like her?
Yeah, I'm more skeptical than a lot of the narrative about she needs to go out there and do interviews was focused on the idea that people just don't know enough about her. And I'm skeptical that that's really the issue here. Our colleague Philip Bump earlier this week looked at the new New York Times Siena College poll that focused on undecided voters and what was a consideration in their vote. And actually, the idea that they needed to know more about Harris and her policies ranked pretty low on the list of things that they were looking for in the campaign. I think this is much more about, getting to undecided voters and making an appeal to them that's more personal. It's not necessarily focused on first-time home buyer credit or things like that. It's much more about not the vibes, but about kind of what's our vision for leadership here and making the case against Donald Trump. And one of the parts of this that I think is really interesting that I saw through a number of these different interviews was where she was talking about things that were like pitching her as being the candidate of strength. She went on 60 Minutes. She talked about how she had a Glock.
What kind of gun do you own, and when and why did you get it?
I have a Glock, and I've had it for quite some time. And look, Bill, my background is in law enforcement. And so there you go.
Which I think was a surprising moment for a lot of people, even though she's mentioned in the past that she's a gun owner. But I think there's something about a Glock that is like, oh man, like this woman is not like messing around.
The stereotypically gritty firearm, if there ever was one, as anybody who, not to bring this back to 90s hip hop like we've talked about on this podcast before, but
Aaron's favorite subject.
It's a popular gun in those lyrics. So a lot of these interviews seem to be aimed at building up her toughness. And I think that suggests that there's a real moment in which the Harris campaign views that as something they need to drive home. We also have Tim Walz making the case to male voters. And then Barack Obama, I thought this was really striking on Thursday night, where he basically made a case to black men that they need to support Harris.
We had not yet seen the same kinds of energy and turnout in all quarters of our neighborhoods and communities as we saw when I was running. Now, I also want to say that seems to be more pronounced with the brothers.
And I thought he said some really interesting things, kind of admonishing the black men who were reluctant to support her.
Yeah, and his tone, I think admonishing is the right way to describe it. It was very much like kind of wagging his finger at them as like, you might give excuses about why you're not voting for her, but, it comes down to you don't think a woman can run or can win or whatever, and like that's not a good reason to not vote for her, and basically like trying to call them on it.
I thought taking that issue head on was a very interesting decision. You do risk looking like you are talking down to people. I think.
Sure.
And so they must perceive this as an issue enough that they need to do something. And it just got me thinking, like, we haven't had a whole lot of talk on this campaign about how reluctant Americans are to vote for a woman. That is an obvious potential issue in all of this. And maybe the Harris campaign is starting to view it as such.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how much that continues or becomes more part of the conversation in the coming weeks. Very few weeks left until the end of this election cycle, this campaign season. Yeah, we're close, guys. We're very close. Though who knows how long it'll be after Election Day.
Quiet down. We can't have that. The election will be over on Election Day, Martine. You know that.
Yeah.
I'm crossing my fingers.
But for now, that's all the time that we have for today. Mariana, thank you so much for being here with us this week.
Thanks for having me.
Mariana Sotomayor covers Congress for The Post. And Aaron, tell us a little bit about your newsletter.
Don't forget to subscribe to the Campaign Moment newsletter. We'll be having more and more editions in the run-up to Election Day.
And of course, you can find the link to the Campaign Moment newsletter in our show notes and at postreports.com.
And if you're tuning in via Post Reports, we will keep bringing you these conversations most Fridays. But you're also able to hear more from me and my colleagues by also following the Campaign Moment show feed itself. Today's episode was produced by Eliza Dennis and mixed by Sam Baer. It was edited by Lucy Perkins and Mary Jo Murphy.
Our team also includes Maggie Penman, Rena Flores, Monica Campbell, Ted Muldoon, Alana Gordon, Ariel Plotnick, Bishop Sand, Rennie Svirnovsky, Sabi Robinson, Emma Talkoff, Sean Carter, Peter Bresnan, Laura Benshoff, Allison Michaels, Renita Jablonski, and Elahe Izadi. I'm Martine Powers.
And I'm Aaron Blake.
Have a great weekend.